Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Prayers of Folly podcast. I'm joined again tonight by Keith Preston to discuss education. And I think we agreed that we were going to start discussing about the history of modern education. Now, modern education sort of begins in Prussia, where, Fichte and the Germans organized the first modern-day public schools, in the modern sense of the word of compulsory education. And the Americans, specifically Horace Mann and others, sort of looked at that model and thought that that was a model that they would want to copy as well. And in fact, it's been copied throughout most of the world. And within the American context, we have this idea that the education system was explicitly designed from the get-go to destroy the sort of creative, autonomous element within the student. The Rockefellers, I think it was in 1912, they ran an institution that quote unquote educated poor black people, and they released, and I think it was the General Board of Education, and they released in one of their issues that their goals for education were to essentially make people pawns that they could manipulate and mold in their image. They don't want people to think for themselves, be men of letters or oratory or anything like that. He said that they wanted people to do what they told them to. And also the American Historical Association, I think it was 1936-37, discussed their plans for education. And again, very similar. They wanted to have a sort of class of technocratic experts that would create curricula and tell people not how to think, but what to think. And I think we can see today that they've been largely successful in that endeavor. What do you think about that?
Yeah, well, modern education starts really with the creation of public school systems, and those were created, I guess, in the early 19th century. You mentioned that the Prussians were pioneers in the creation of public state-run schools and universities. And those, I know, in the United States began in the early 19th century. And as long as the state has had control over education, it's always been the case that the first purpose of education is to inculcate in the students the ideology of the state as it exists at the time. Now, that may vary depending on what the actual state that's in power is or what particular group within the state is. But the overwhelming priority has always been the inculcation of state ideology. In fact, if we go back and look at American education as it was back in the 19th century, early 20th century, we see that specifically much of education was used for the idea of assimilating Americans into this idea of this common American identity, this common American nationalism. This was the time period of the Ellis Island immigrants, and it was thought that the public school system could be used to assimilate immigrants and make them into Americans and remove whatever identity they previously had as, Italians or Czechs or Irish or whatever. And if there's an interesting picture that exists where there's a picture of a group of school kids in the early 20th century. They're doing the Roman salute to the American flag. In fact, that was a salute that was commonly used back then by a lot of different kinds of groups. It's now obviously considered taboo because of its association with the Nazis. But the American flag, the Pledge of Allegiance to the American flag, that was something that was introduced into the public school system in the early 20th century during the Progressive era, which was this is the era when the public education system was really starting to expand. And the Pledge of Allegiance was actually written interestingly, by a guy who was some kind of socialist. He was some kind of socialist that wanted to inculcate these kinds of nationalistic, state-centric ideas into the students. And it's always interesting to see how totalitarian regimes are specifically motivated to control education and to disallow alternative forms of education. Whether it's Nazi Germany or Soviet Russia or North Korea or any of these places, the core idea behind the principle of education in any kind of system like that is that there's an official state ideology, and this must be taught as the truth by any educational institution, and alternative points of view are not permitted. I don't know that it's quite that extreme in the American educational system or in most modern Western educational systems, but it's clearly true that there is an overarching ideological structure that is taught in educational systems, and is, more or less, educators, education professionals are more or less expected to give at least lip service to this set of ideas. And the content of it may have varied over time. For example, I don't know, I would imagine in the public schools today, it's been a long time since I was in one, but I would imagine in the public schools today, the kind of nationalism that you might have seen in the public school system at one point, it probably may not be as prevalent. It may instead have been replaced by this kind of modern progressive ideology, multiculturalism, and all of this kind of stuff. But whatever kind of state educational system you have, there's going to be some sort of ideological superstructure that the state has. It's a self-legitimating ideology, and that's going to be taught in the state's educational system.
Yeah. You'd mentioned earlier as well that it was a way to create a kind of cultural uniformity. So not only were immigrants from Europe, but also Native Americans were also forced to go through the system to make them into. Well, it's funny, the way it was sold was that it would make people into good Anglo-Saxon Protestants, and it turns out that that system, that tool, has now come to turn against the Anglo-Saxon Protestants. And now, instead of inculcating Christianity and the values of the WASP, now it's doing exactly the opposite. It's advocating relativism and humanism and internationalism.
Yeah, one thing that's interesting about that is that there's a lot of institutions in the United States that were originally founded as, I guess you could say, traditional or quote unquote conservative Protestant institutions that are now some of the most left-wing or anti-traditional or whatever you want to call them institutions out there. Places like Yale, Harvard, a lot of the other well-known major universities, and the public school system as well. The public school system, I think the public school system in the United States really got underway in the early 19th century in New England. In fact, it was a lot of the more liberal Protestants, I guess you could call them, of the time period that really pushed the idea of the public school system, the Unitarians and some of those people. But it's interesting how ever since that time, the public school system, it has ironically drifted continuously towards the left in terms of its overall ideological values. Even when it was combined with nationalism, like it's interesting that like something like the Pledge of Allegiance could have been written by a socialist on one hand, but who was also a nationalist on the other hand. It looks like it's like you're getting the worst of all worlds with some of that.
Yeah, we do see that, where you have on the one hand the nationalism and the socialism, but I think one of the things again that is so central to the public education system, at least in America and probably other parts of the world as well, is this education. I mean, I don't want to create any sort of halcyon days that never existed, but once upon a time, the purpose of education was to teach you how to think rather than what to think. Through the West, the modern West, inherited through ancient Greece and Rome and Christendom, the quadrivium and the trivium. The trivium taught grammar, logic, and rhetoric. Grammar was how to write, syntax, grammar, and all that. Logic was how to think. Rhetoric was how to speak. The quadrivium taught arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. And one of the ways that they would use to teach like that is they would read the accounts of past men, and then they would ask the students, did those men behave in an honorable fashion? If so, how so? If not, how did they not? And how would you have reacted differently in that situation? Or how should you have reacted in that situation? And, we see, especially from my experience at college, there's really any attempt to think outside the box, to think in a way other than generally within the rubric that the professor gives you, is going to, if not get you penalized, at least make you less popular with the professor and maybe even some of the students. And, The quote that I was thinking of from the Rockefellers, it was from the General Board of Education, 1913, and this is what they said about their goal for. Now, this was a narrow attempt to educate poor Black people in the rural South. In our dreams, we have limitless resources, and the people yield themselves with perfect docility to our molding hands. Present education conventions fade from their minds, and unhampered by tradition, we work our own goodwill upon a grateful and resentful rural folk. We shall not try to make these people or any of their children philosophers or men of learning or men of science. We have not to raise up from among them authors, editors, poets, or men of letters. We shall not search for the embryo of great artists, painters, musicians, nor lawyers, doctors, preachers, politicians, statesmen, of whom we have an ample supply. The task we have set before ourselves is very simple, as well as a very beautiful one, to train these people as we find them into the perfect ideal life just where they are. So we organize our children and teach them to do in a perfect way the things their fathers and mothers did in an imperfect way in their homes, in their shops, and on their farm. And one of the things that when I grew up, I always wondered, like, where are the great poets, artists, we had in the past. We have look at, like, for instance, in 17th and 18th and 19th century Europe, you had all these composers and musicians all across the width and breadth of Europe. You had poets and authors, and I wondered growing up where they had gone. And part of it is the education system selects against them intentionally.
Well, I think one real problem that has happened with modern education is that the more democratized that education has become, the lower the quality of it has become. In older societies, typically education was reserved for the elite, and the masses really didn't get much in the way of education. And while there were certainly disadvantages to that, one of the advantages is that education didn't quite have the effect of holding back more talented students or students of greater ability than like it does now. I think a real problem with mass education is that the more massive it becomes, the more you have to dumb it down to make it workable with people that otherwise have very limited academic ability. For example, in my grandparents' generation, both of my maternal grandparents had, I think, something like a 7th or 8th grade education, and that was considered good enough back in those days. In my parents' generation, if you had a high school education, that was pretty good. If you had some college, that was really good. If you graduated from college, that was awesome. And nowadays, probably most people have a college degree, or a substantial number of people have a college degree. Something like 10% of the population now has a graduate level education, and certainly the majority of people graduate from high school now. And while it's not that we necessarily want to go back to having a society where most people are high school dropouts, it is problematic when you have a society where everyone goes to college, or everyone goes to school all the way through high school, and then most people go on to college, and curriculum has to be designed on that kind of common level. I think that one of the effects of that is that it has the effect of dumbing down the curriculum, and in the long run, that holds back more gifted students and more talented students in order to accommodate less gifted or less talented students. I think there are ways of dealing with that effectively. I mean, I think there needs to be a lot more specialization in education. There needs to be a lot more stratification in education, meaning that students in high schools that have no aptitude for certain fields should not be holding everyone else back in classes on advanced algebra and stuff like that. I mean, students who have no competence or interest in those kinds of subjects should be studying carpentry and bricklaying and those kinds of auto mechanics and things like that. There's no reason to put students who have no ability in advanced writing classes and things like that. I think that there needs to be a lot more stratification in terms of levels of ability and qualifications when it comes to education at every level. And also there needs to be a lot more specialization. The students should be studying things that are going to be of some use to them in their own life. They should be studying things that are going to help them to develop their own abilities. I think a real problem, though, with approaching education from this perspective is this what I call educationist ideology. There are many people in public administration and government, in the education profession and other relevant fields that have this idea that education is the solution to everything. We can save the world with education. We just have to have more and more educated people. And while it's always better to have more educated people than fewer educated people, the kind of education also matters, and the kind of and the purpose of the education also matters. And simply saying, okay, we're just going to send everybody to school for 12 years, or we're going to send everybody to college for 4 years, irrespective of competence, ability, motivation, goals and objectives, and all these kinds of things, I think has the impact of essentially dumbing down education to where nowadays high schools are just glorified middle schools or even elementary schools. Colleges now, undergraduate colleges, are really just glorified high schools. I've had professors tell me this, professors who are older people in their 60s and 70s who have been in academia their whole life, say this, that nowadays the undergraduate education is just a glorified high school. And I think it's getting worse. I think with some of these degree mill colleges, these things where you can take courses online you have all these degree mills like Strayer and Kaplan, and there are a lot, Phoenix, there are a lot of them like that. There are tons of them. Where you can get a PhD online with never setting foot in a classroom and never directly interacting with an instructor. I've looked at the curriculum that's associated with some of those kinds of places, and the curriculum often is literally on a middle school level for something like you have freshman and sophomore, junior level college classes being taught on a middle school level. And it's unbelievable how ridiculous some of it gets. So I think that what's happening is that nowadays more and more people are getting loaded up with all of these degrees, but the quality of what they're getting is far inferior to what education once was.
Yeah. One point that's related to what you brought up is so much of modern day education is actually just a glorified trade school. What you'll do is you have people getting degrees to then get a job. Whereas historically, you usually had, again, trade schools or guilds would take care of that kind of work. You go and you'd be mentored by a master, and then he would train you how to, do what you're supposed to do. That's just for your job, for your living, for these highly specialized fields, as you're talking about, like say, literature or philosophy or physics, things like that, where it's not really just the 9-to-5 grind. That should be separate from the actual vocation. It's like the vocational schools have been shoved into the liberal arts and tech school academies, so that you have people that are just trying to learn how to get a job. Because as you said, to get a job these days, you need more than just a high school or even 8th grade education, and that's a problem. Another problem related to this is grade inflation. If anybody's seen the online 1895 Salina, Kansas high school final grade exam, that is tough. And it's only 8th grade. And, in 8th grade today, most college students today couldn't take the 8th grade Kansas exam from 1895. And so there's been a general decline in the quality of the education, even at the level of the grade. I think in part why you could get by with 8th grade education or high school education in your parents' and grandparents' day, Keith, is that they had a better overall quality of education, and they could literally get by with better, with less rather. And the other thing is with the, for instance, if you look at letters written by Civil War soldiers, and compare that, with an 8th grade education, then you get an 8th grader today. The 8th grader today can barely spell, but these, relatively ignorant people, 8th grade in the 1860s, could write today that would, many college students would struggle to write at. And if you look at the presidents and they give speeches to the American people, say in the time of, say, Woodrow Wilson, it was like maybe a high school level education was expected of the audience. If you listen to the quality of the speeches given today by people like George W. Bush and Barack Obama and Donald Trump, the education assumed is about a 6th or 7th grade education. And it's worse than it sounds, because not only is the educational standard lower, it's actually of a lower quality because of grade inflation.
Well, I know that from my own experiences on a lot of levels. I have letters, for example, that my parents have written to me, or my late grandparents have written to me, or other family members who did not have college degrees, and in some cases did not even have a high school education. Where if you read these letters, it's written in proper spelling, proper English, proper grammar, things like that. It's readable, it's legible. On the other hand, I teach college students, and most of my students are undergrads. They're usually freshmen and sophomores, sometimes juniors and seniors. And I have students who have, I presume, have finished high school and are now in college, and they will turn in papers that do not have a single complete sentence in the entire paper, that are written in Valley Girl language, like things like, like Karl Marx was like this guy who had this idea called communism. Or they will write papers in text message language, like you, like the letter U for you, or something like that. Or instead of saying, like if they're saying, "Are you going somewhere?" it's "are" with the letter R going somewhere. This isn't a formal academic paper. I've had students that their idea of writing a paper was simply cutting and pasting a Wikipedia article onto a Word document. I've had students that would literally misspell virtually every word in a paper, except for the most basic things. And I think that the real problem is that the school system is letting them get by with that. I mean, when I was growing up, I went to public and private schools at various points, and neither the public schools nor the private schools would have ever allowed students to pass courses or examinations or assignments that was done that sloppily. So I think the schools are really failing a lot of students on a lot of different levels. Now, I think it depends on what schools you're talking about. Now, there are some public schools that are really good, usually in more affluent and wealthy communities. I think in particular the inner city schools are awful. Those students that I've had from that kind of background, I can tell that they've had grossly incompetent people teaching them in the past. And I think there's some of the more poor areas of the United States, that's an issue as well. But I think that you're right in the sense that the students aren't held to any kind of academic standards at all. Things that would have never been acceptable in any past educational systems nowadays take place on a regular basis. One problem, getting back to what I was saying about the mass education now, is that I think that with industrialization happening in the early 20th century, and the subsequent cyber revolution and all of that we've had in more recent years, the problem there, one of the negative consequences of that is it requires many more skilled workers to produce and manage all of that kind of stuff, the technology and all of that. And what you start seeing throughout the 20th century is the need for more and more skilled workers who can work on assembly lines, and who can be technicians, and who can have these kinds of office administrative skills and things like that. In fact, I think that's one of the main reasons why women were eventually integrated into the workforce the way that they were, is that there was simply a need for an ever greater number of skilled workers, and they were getting more and more, getting them from wherever they could, men, women, minorities, whomever. And that in turn has influenced the way education is done. It's like you were saying, students are being trained to be workers. It's interesting how the whole educationist ideology really starts to take off in the early 20th century, right at the same time that you had concepts like Fordism and Taylorism being introduced in industry and in public administration as forms of organizational management. It's sort of like the public school system was Fordism or Taylorism applied to education. And that's continued to expand ever since then. I think now the same system is being applied to higher education. There was an interesting book that came out a few years back. It's well known in the social sciences. It's a book called McDonaldization, and it's by a sociologist named George Ritzer. And he's talking about how higher education now, like a lot of other institutions, is starting to operate almost like on a fast food model. You sign up, for example, for these online classes, or you you go to college and it's more like you're going to a resort or something like that. You're not going to a university. You're going to a summer camp or something of that nature. It's all about entertainment. And the impact of that is to really dumb down the quality of education, I think, a great deal. And a lot of people really are not being educated very well at all.
Yeah, it's kind of ironic that, as you pointed out, the education was democratized to bring in more people to have highly trained technical experts to run the modern industry. But in so doing, they've then lowered the standards of education so they're not competent for the very purpose for which they were educated.
Yeah, well, I think that one of the problems is that not only did they have to dumb it down to make it consumable by the masses, but they also had to refocus the direction. Where, nowadays you have tons of students that go through their entire undergraduate education and never take a single philosophy class. They never take a single class on anything related to classics. They don't have a clue who Aristotle was, or any of that. And as you were saying earlier, the branches of education that are motivated to tell you how to think or help you learn how to think for yourself, there's a lot of de-emphasis of that, I think. Instead, most education today is more technical training. Ironically, in the humanities related fields and social sciences and things like that, I think a lot of that is the sector of education that is most heavily dominated by ideological fanaticism, if you will. What I have observed, for example, is that a lot of people, particularly people on the right, conservatives and others, complain about how political correctness dominates so much of higher education, and it does. But I think where you find that is mostly in social sciences and humanities fields. Like you find, depending on the discipline that you're studying, you can find a range of opinion in academia. Like in technology departments, those are not necessarily ideological because they're not dealing with ideological questions. Science, I suppose it depends on what kind of science you're talking about, but scientific departments are actually quite good in many instances, mathematical departments. But when you get into the other fields, depending on where you are, you're going to find a lot of ideological rigidity that trends very far towards the left. For example, history is considered to be the most conservative of any humanities related field, and yet most history professors lean center left to far left. When you get into the social sciences proper, like sociology and all of that kind of stuff, that tends to lean hard left. And then when you get into the stuff that's more derivative, like the ethnic studies and gender studies and all that leans Twilight Zone left. And now you can find people from other kinds of perspectives in other disciplines as well. You can find, for example, libertarians and free market conservatives in economics departments. You can find a lot of neocon types in international relations and political science and stuff like that. So there is variation, but increasingly what I see in education is, on one hand, it's being dumbed down to accommodate an ever greater number of students. It's become more oriented towards technical training, where it's more like just teaching people to be good workers and good consumers. It's Taylorism applied to education. And where ideas and things like that come into it, it's also becoming increasingly ideologically rigid with this kind of center left to hard left ideological perspective.
Yes. I would say that in the sciences, where you will find ideological rigidity rivaling the humanities, is in those areas of the science, is in those departments where there's the Christian students come in, because then they're gonna push the atheism really hard, in much the same way that the social sciences are going to push liberalism very hard. So you can, and I suppose if you want to get an engineering degree, not so much, but in things like astronomy and biology, yeah, you're going to have a lot of that ideological rigidity there.
Well, also the environmental sciences, when you start dealing with climate change and some of those kinds of issues.
Yeah, that too. But you mentioned William S. Lind. He spoke of these institutions as Ivy Ivy covered North Korea's. And one of the things that we see, especially in, like you said, the humanities, about this, the ridiculousness of this ideological rigidity, is that you have these rent-a-mobs of students that shout down and gerrymander and try to just shut down speakers, invited speakers to campuses that do not toe the progressive line. Not only that, there'll be acts of even vandalism. There's been libertarian people that have had, bags full of urine thrown at them or rotten food. And, I remember, there are cases where people could just get shouted down. That you can't be heard over the roar of the mob. And the idea that this could happen, say 50 years ago would be unheard of. I mean, just absolutely unheard of.
Yeah, well, that kind of thing is becoming increasingly common. I hear more and more stories about that kind of stuff all the time. I know one recent case like that was, Richard Spencer, whom we know from the alt-right. He has gotten a fair amount of media coverage lately, due to the Trump phenomena, the alt-right getting some recognition because of Hillary Clinton coming out and denouncing it. But I know Richard Spencer was speaking at Texas A&M recently, and I think that just because Richard was there, the students actually had some kind of stadium rally, like in the campus stadium, they had some sort of, anti-racism rally or something like that. It's like one guy comes to campus that has ideas they don't like, so they have to have a stadium rally in opposition. It's when someone like Milo Yiannopoulos speaks, not exactly a conservative by any means, but even when a guy like that speaks, you have people running up on the stage trying to keep him from speaking. And Ben Shapiro. I've watched a video once of Ben Shapiro trying to speak at some particular gathering, and there was essentially a riot going on. He's like this, kind of nerdy Republican guy, not a Nazi. In fact, he's Jewish. So it is interesting to watch the kind of hysteria that's being exhibited. I mean, even over relatively small differences of opinion, or even over differences of opinion that are well within the realm of the mainstream, in terms of what's supposed to be acceptable within the kind of center-right, center-left paradigm. And then you have the trigger warnings and the safe spaces and all of that kind of stuff. I've heard, there've been reports about students, actually having crying sessions because Donald Trump won the election, or professors shutting down exams for the day so everybody can deal with the trauma of Donald Trump actually having gotten elected. Or they have these safe rooms where they actually give them crayons and Play-Doh and coloring books and stuff like that, like it's nursery school or something. And it's, I don't, one thing I would qualify with that is I don't know how pervasive that is per se. Like, I've never seen any actual statistical data showing how representative that is of academia as a whole. Sometimes you have to be careful when it comes to anecdotal evidence, because you can take, bizarre or aberrational cases and hold that up as being the norm when it's not. So I don't know that I would be prepared to present all of academia as a crying session on the part of Hillary voters or something like that. But that kind of stuff does seem to become increasingly common. And it is true that the academic world is becoming increasingly censorious of points of view that don't adhere to this kind of politically correct party line. One interesting example, for example, is someone like Norman Finkelstein being denied tenure at DePaul, on the grounds that, he's implicitly, the obvious reason for that was because of his criticisms of Israel. Even though this guy's Jewish, he's the son of Holocaust survivors. Ayan Hirsa Ali was supposed to get an honorary degree from Brandeis. This is a woman from the Sudan. No, she's from Somalia, I believe. But she actually had a clitoridectomy performed on her when she was like 12 or something like that. And she, is now, for obvious reasons, is an outspoken critic of Islamic extremism. And, she was barred from Brandeis because she's an Islamophobe. And this kind of fanatical, obscurantist kind of thinking does seem to be becoming increasingly common in certain sectors of academia. And I think one of the worst things about it is that the administration of universities goes along with this. In fact, they not only go along with it, they facilitate it and encourage it. They will seek to deny tenure to instructors that are not politically correct. They will encourage students that are acting out with these kinds of idiotic protests against speakers, those ideas they don't like, and things like that.
Yeah, yeah. One other point to make is Bertrand Russell. He was very interested in the development of technology in society, and in his 1952 work, The Impact of Science on Technology, mentions how education will be used to help control the masses. And he has this very chilling sentence on page 61. It is to be expected that advances in physiology and psychology will give governments much more control over the individual mentality than they now have, even in totalitarian countries. And I think in many ways we're beginning to, this was in 52, so that was 60 years ago. Well, a little more than 60 years ago, and it seems that we see a lot of that now. The kind of uniformity, conformity, control that the state through education exerts on its populace is many, many orders of magnitude greater than what you would have seen in, say, 1950. For instance, what's very interesting is in studying the Second World War, I've often read, memoirs or first-hand accounts of the men that were either in the war or saw the war. So they were probably then educated in the 20s or 30s, or even earlier maybe, depending how old they were. But you look at the way they write and the sort of open-mindedness they have. I mean, we have this sort of propaganda narrative, almost a cartoon narrative of World War II. But you actually read some of these soldiers and politicians and admirals, and they sound very, very objective. Yeah, we fought for America, it's our country, we think we did. But they question some of the things that happened. Wiedemeyer comes to mind, the guy that was famous for his stint in China. Admiral Leahy condemned the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He was theater commander of the Pacific. So did Eisenhower, for that matter. The idea that, the theater commanders of Europe and the Pacific both condemned the atomic bombings of Japan. It's inconceivable today that anybody in the civilian or military world, well, the military world anyhow, would condemn such measures, saturation bombing of, say, cities in Iraq or Afghanistan. And it's just interesting to see how in an older generation, they were more free thinking, even having gone through public education. But 60 years on, it's almost inconceivable that somebody would rise to that level of influence in any political position and still be that free thinking and that much of their own man.
Well, it's interesting to see how that's evolved over time. I think there's a certain paradox involved. I know I used to have a friend of mine years ago that was a little bit older than me. He's probably about 20 years, maybe closer to 25 years older than me. But he had graduated from high school in New York City in 1960. And back then, to graduate from high school, you had to take a loyalty oath. It was, I guess it was when the McCarthyism thing or whatever was still, fairly common. But you had to take some sort of loyalty oath to graduate from high school. And he was actually a student who led some kind of student movement to oppose loyalty oaths. And, the left started out in part in the 60s in places like Berkeley with the free speech movement and all of that kind of stuff. And the idea at the time was to allow controversial ideas to be heard on campuses and allow student activism and allow critics of the Vietnam War, critics of the military-industrial complex or whatever, to speak on campuses. But now it's almost a reverse of that. Nowadays, now that the left controls education to the degree that they do, the exact opposite has happened, where nowadays it's all about keeping out any point of view that doesn't toe the progressive line. I think a reason for that is that over time, the left has really targeted education as an institution of that they really wanted to infiltrate in many ways and gain control of. Not in the sense of some organized conspiracy, but in the sense that just a lot of people from that political perspective, for whatever reason, ended up in academia, and they ended up being heads of departments and the people that set curriculum and being professors and administrators and university presidents and all kinds of things. And as a result, now you have this kind of progressive orthodoxy that dominates the world of education, in a way that the church might have dominated education in Europe in the Middle Ages or something of that nature. It's or the way Islam would dominate education in some Middle Eastern societies. And I think the influence of the left is more mixed in a lot of other institutions, but I think education is one where it pretty much reigns supreme. Maybe not every single place in education. Maybe not public school systems in rural Kansas or something like that, or certainly not at, say, Bob Jones University or something like that. But for the most part, I think certainly with institutions of higher education and many, I think, public school systems as well, the left really has a grip on education, and in a way that's become very rigid in terms of trying to enforce a type of orthodoxy.
Yes. No, but isn't Bob Jones a private institution? So then
it is, yeah.
In that case, it would fall outside the purview, but of all that. But the so maybe to move on, one of the things we could look at is what were some alternatives to the modern system. There's a few that's been tried. There's homeschooling, there's unschooling. So maybe why don't you break down some of the proffered alternatives?
Well, there's a wide range of ideas that have been proposed as to how to go about creating alternatives to the kind of public school system that we have. One is simply greater local control. Increasingly, control over education becomes centralized to where it's all run by the federal government and according to mandates that are issued by the Department of Education and things like that. Nowadays we have. I know back when George Bush was president, they had the No Child Left Behind thing, and more recently there's been Common Core, and even back during the Bill Clinton era, they had what they called outcome-based education, and all of these are these ways in which the federal government is trying to gain control over local education to a much greater degree and impose these kinds of rigid, uniform standards that don't really allow any kind of flexibility. And I think that getting control of public education back to states and localities and things like that would be one way, one more moderate way. Other things that have been proposed have been things like school choice, the voucher system, where you can more or less go to whatever school you want. You get a voucher to help pay your tuition or school fees or whatever. Whether it's public or private or parochial school or whatever. Then there's open enrollment. There's the neighborhood school idea. There's homeschool. That's what's called unschooling. There are, and then in terms of education methods, you have some of the more classic kind of anarchistic methods like the modern school that Francisco Ferrer ran in Spain, and then the Summerhill School by A.S. Neal. More recently, there's in more recent decades, the Montessori system is one like that. But I think that one important thing when it comes to education methods is that there needs to be competition between educational systems and education methods. More and more, it's moving towards a kind of one size fits all. For example, when it comes to the ideological framework in which education takes place, there needs to be schools that teach all kinds of things. It's fine to have schools that teach from a progressive left-wing type of perspective, but we also need Catholic schools, and we also need evangelical Protestant schools, and we also need Muslim schools, and we also need Mormon schools, and we also need conservative schools, whatever that would be, Hillsdale College or something like that. There needs to be schools that have a range of ideological perspectives that are offered so that there's ideological competition between ideas in the wider society. Schools need to be able to experiment with education methods, and find out what works and what doesn't work. I think one thing is that local control of schools is very important. School systems should be able to set curriculum according to what's necessary for their particular school district, or what the students and parents and the community members want, as the consumers of school services. And having an educational system that's controlled by the federal government or some central authority like the Department of Education basically amounts to a dictatorship. It's basically educational totalitarianism, and that's not a good idea when you're dealing with institutions that are responsible for disseminating ideas. It's just like we don't want to have a centralized state-controlled media. We don't want to have centralized state-controlled education either. And so I think introducing alternative methods of education, competition between types of education is all very important. I think that much needs to be done to improve the quality of education that's given to people from poor communities, like poor Black kids in the inner city, poor white kids in the rural areas or wherever. Those are the school systems or those are the classes of students that are the most neglected, and they're the ones that get to have the least qualified teachers in education. I think something needs to be done to correct that. Now, as far as how to do it or who should do it or how we're going to pay for it, whether it's government or corporate or philanthropic or whatever is a different question. But the quality of education that some people are getting in the public school system is really crummy. There are other public school systems that aren't that bad, but there needs to be more diversity in education. There needs to be more consideration of alternative ways of conducting education. Homeschooling is really interesting. I've actually taught students in college who were homeschooled and had never been in school in their life. I mean, they were, say, a freshman in college, and this was like their first semester in school. And it was interesting how educated and how smart some of these students were. Now, some of them seemed to have some other problems. I will say that some of them did seem to have some other developmental problems and stuff. But in terms of the quality of education they received, they were just as literate, they were just as articulate, they were just as skilled as any other students, and often much more so. I've had students that went through public schools their entire life and were illiterate. So I think that this what the impact that I see, and I know talking to people I know who have children who are in, say, elementary school or high school, one thing they'll talk about is the way now that everything in school is geared towards passing these tests, these standardized tests, where you have to have this kind of cookie cutter textbook knowledge of all of these different things. And nowadays, much of education is oriented towards preparing students for these tests. And then the schools really emphasize this because a lot of their funding is dependent on how the students do on these tests and things like that. That's a terrible way to go about doing education. Another concern when it comes to higher education is the student loan racket. Most jobs that I've had in academia as an instructor, the only thing my employers ever cared about was making sure all the grades and attendance records were turned in on time so that they could collect student loan money from the federal government. That was the only thing that the institution as a whole really cared about. I always kind of got the impression that, I could get up in front of classes and teach out of Spider-Man comic books or something if I wanted to, as long as the student, the college or university was collecting its student loan money. Now, I don't want to paint too bleak a picture of education, because most people that I know personally who work in education, who are professors, who are public school teachers, who are university administrators, the overwhelming majority of people I know who work in education either believe in what they do, or at least they take their job somewhat seriously. I mean, they're not just goofing off all the time, or they're not there to necessarily to spread some crazy political agenda or anything like that, or they're not merely just disinterested bureaucrats collecting a paycheck. I mean, most people I know in education, take their profession reasonably seriously. But I do think that structurally, there's a whole lot of problems with the way education is done. Dumbing down of education. I think particularly with the lower socioeconomic levels, overly rigid control over education by central authority, overly ideological education, lack of flexibility in terms of educational models. So these are all things I think need to be addressed somewhat.
Yeah, well, as being homeschooled myself, I have to admit that's what I'm partial to. I don't know if you remember, but in the late '90s, early 2000s, homeschooling really made a big splash when it had many of the national spelling bee winners were homeschool kids. There was, I think, like a half a dozen or more in that maybe 15, 20-year period that were homeschooled, and that's when it really started to get national attention because they were at this really high level scholastic achievement were beating out, what was presumed to be the best, the public school kids. Also, the geography bee, which I think was sponsored by National Geographic, they're around a similar time. Homeschoolers made a splash there too. One of the things that now you mentioned also there's unschooling. Now that's actually become quite popular with libertarians and anarchists recently, and I'm highly skeptical of unschooling. It's pretty much, I mean, at some point, self-direction is good. In fact, that's a lot of my education in high school was self-directed. But you have to sort of lay a certain foundation before a person is competent to self-direct their education. And to start off with self-directed education without laying that foundation, I mean, I know when I was between 6 and 12, I didn't want to study. I mean, if I'd have been self-directed, I'd just probably been playing video games. I mean, that's kind of a recipe for disaster.
Yeah, the unschooling movement is actually somewhat similar to models of education that were promoted back in the early 20th century by some hardcore radicals. And the idea, as I understand it, is that you simply let children do whatever they want and just pursue their own interests, and then you encourage them in those interests. It's kind of like you give the kid a room full of books, and whatever they decide to read, well, okay, great, that's what they're into, so just give them more books on that topic, or something like that. I see some problems with that in the sense that, first of all, to be a competent individual, you have to have certain basic skills. I mean, you have to know how to speak articulately. You have to know how to do basic mathematics. You have to be able to write literately. And those are basic life skills. Those are not just optional aspects of education. Beyond that, the idea is to get a well-rounded education. We don't want people growing up in society with absolutely no knowledge of history, no knowledge of cultural history, art and literature and stuff like that, no knowledge of philosophical concepts. Now, that doesn't mean we need to have everybody in high school sitting there studying Plato and stuff like that. I think that would be a bad idea. People should study what they have an ability for. There should be advanced classes that study those kinds of topics, and then there should be vocational classes for people that are more inclined in that direction and things like that. But the idea that education should have no organization to it or no structure at all, I see as problematic, and I don't know that would turn out very well. Like as you were saying, I've had homeschooled students who were extremely intelligent and extremely educated. I had a student once who was in college at age 16, and he was by far the smartest student in the class. Now, he may have been that anyway. I mean, even if he hadn't been homeschooled, he may or may not have been. But there was certainly nothing wrong with the education that he had received prior to that. And one thing I have seen with some homeschool students is that it all depends on their own background, their own family background, and things like that. But some of them do seem to have some problems with development on a more social level. I have seen that. They tend to be working in groups and things like that seems to be more of a problem. Or they also tend, sometimes I would find that they were more sensitive to certain things. On the other hand, though, they not nearly as much as the ones that are obsessed with trigger warnings and safe spaces and things like that. But I think, though, that one thing that does need to be emphasized when it comes to education is quality, not just quantity, but quality, and also genuine diversity in terms of methodology and diversity in terms of ideology.
Yeah, I would agree. I think from my perspective, one of the worst disasters in the past 100 years of education was the ending of the teaching of the trivium, because the trivium taught you rhetoric, logic, and let me look up that. I just rattled it all off a little minute ago. Logic, rhetoric, and grammar. I mean, logic right now doesn't even exist in curricula. People can't think. They don't know what an elementary fallacy is. They don't know what a syllogism is. And one of that's partly why modern day discourse is so shallow and also aggressive and combative, is because arguments are seen as personal attacks for whatever reason, rather than, right, as the saying goes, attack the idea, not the person, right? Attacking the person's an ad hominem.
Right.
But they don't even know that. And again, it's because logic has been completely gutted from the system. Nobody learns what a syllogism is. Nobody learns what a formal or informal fallacy is, or Aristotle's square of opposition. And so nobody knows how to think. And in 1984, now this was about language, but it's the same idea, is they kept on rewriting the dictionaries every so often. So nobody could know what words meant. And if you use, words from out of the dictionary, that would be indication that you were politically unreliable. You might get into trouble. That's sort of what happens here. People never get taught how to think, how to organize their thoughts, how to rationally go from point A to point B in an argument. And so they're not able to articulate their position. So, right, is they say, if people can't read, which is the whole point of 1984, then they can't organize against Big Brother, because you can't talk to one another. You can't communicate to one another to organize to resist Big Brother. Well, if you can't think, if you lack the structures of thought necessary to think, then you also can't organize against Big Brother either. So I think part of this is that not teaching logic, which again, like you said, it's one of those things you just have to know to be a functional human being. You have to learn how to speak, how to read, how to write, basic mathematics, basic logic, basic facts of history, just so you're able to function as a person in society. And logic is, I think, one of the key elements that has been cut out of the curricula.
Well, yeah, I think that you do see a lot of people nowadays that have no clue as to how to go about building a rational argument. In fact, I think that's one of the reasons why there's such an emphasis on things like feelings among within a lot of discourse. You don't like somebody's argument because of how it makes you feel, or it makes you feel bad that somebody challenges your ideas or something like that, which is in turn viewed as a personal attack and an attack on your identity. If you're some kind of minority or a woman or whatever, that automatically makes it a racist attack or a sexist attack or something like that. I see that kind of thinking a lot in discourse. And in fact, I see it even among more educated people. I remember listening to a discussion once of a couple of college professors. This wasn't in any kind of forum. This was actually a conversation I was party to. There were a couple of college professors talking about gun control. And one of them was talking about how the real essence of the gun control debate is, how do guns make you feel? Do you feel safer because you have a gun in your house at night in case somebody breaks in to rob you and you can shoot them? Or do you feel unsafe because people have guns in society and that creates an environment that you feel insecure in? As if that has anything to do with actual controlling crime or preventing crime or anything like that. It seems like obviously a far more rational way to discuss an issue like that would be, well, what is the impact of guns on crime? Is the free flow of guns in society going to reduce crime or increase crime? What's the actual evidence? Not about how guns make someone feel, which is kind of a bizarre argument. But I do see those kinds of arguments being made quite a bit, about topical issues and things like that. It's including by people that really ought to know better.
Yeah. Well, we're about out of time. So is there anything you want to say before we close out?
Just that I do think that it's important to give some thought to this idea about what a better system of education might be. More and more, I see the quality of education in the United States being dumbed down in terms of university curriculum that's being taught on a middle school level. Grossly incompetent students being admitted to universities. High schools that are just glorified elementary schools. Undergraduate schools that are glorified high schools. Elementary schools that are just glorified nursery schools. I think that that's going to be a real problem in the future. Raising up entire generations of people that are essentially incompetent from an academic perspective is going to be an issue. And I think there's some class issues associated with that. I think that people of education and I mean people of affluence and wealth and things like that normally get fairly good quality educations. But I think that among the lower socioeconomic levels, the quality of education there is getting worse and worse, and that's going to be a real problem in the future. It's going to help to widen class divisions, which are already very wide in our own society.
All right. Well, thanks for coming on, Keith. This is Todd Lewis of the Prayers of Folly podcast, signing off.